Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be taking a look at this morning at the 6 steps to an effective IT oversight program. And joining me as my guest today is somebody very qualified to cover this topic. It's Charles Beard, who's a principal with PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, and he's with their forensic services focusing on computer crime. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, TK.
Now, I must admit, on this show, we have spent a fair amount of time on this attacks, crime. We've had the FBI in looking at economic espionage.
Sure.
But when you pick up the paper every day and you see that not only the businesses, but the government and the Defense Department and everybody's being hacked, this is not an insignificant problem. So
right.
One of the challenges that we always identify is this is a skill set that is not typically resident on a board of directors. So it creates an additional challenge because this is sort of a new challenge for boards. So one of the reasons that I was excited to have you on is that PwC has created a resource guide as part of its What Works Best series. This particular one that I'm thinking of was the Directors in IT. And the thing that I liked about it most was it created a structure. It created something that somebody could follow in the way of making sure that they were performing their duty. And what I'd like you to do for the first part of the show is I'd like you to sort of walk through those 6 steps so that our audience can understand sort of the recommended structure on making sure that they're fulfilling this oversight duty.
Great. Well, and we recognize the challenge, and that's one of the reasons we put together the guide. You know, so many of the conversations that have been taking place on this topic with boards have been in very much technical jargon, language they don't understand, but there is a language board members do understand, and that's one about compliance and oversight. And so we created the structure to sort of help them think about this particular operational risk in that framework. And so the first of those that we really talk about is, from a people perspective, who's really responsible for this within the company? What's the tone at the top that management is sort of setting? Are people being properly trained? So again, you sort of get the sense that from a people perspective, are we as a company doing what is necessary on this particular topic? The second that we get into is priorities. Look, you can't protect everything equally. And so how has management thought about the specific data protection duties and obligations that the company has taken on? And they're going to come in 2 forms. They're either going to be mandatory, in which case they're driven by statutory or regulatory obligations, or they're voluntary, in which case we've taken on certain obligations from a contractual perspective. The third is, from an operational risk perspective, how do we think about that? And is it properly reflected in the artifacts of the company? And that's sort of in 2 different places. One is as it relates to enterprise technical debt. So those are the business decisions that we may have made with respect to deferring technical upgrades of our infrastructure. Perhaps we've done acquisitions, but we've not done the IT integration, and so we're sitting on a substantial portion of deprecated hardware and software. Perhaps we've gone into countries where we know from our risk register that they, maybe they're not where they need to be on the corruption index, but have we built compensating controls on that? So that's the technical debt aspect. The second part of that is really the third party aspect. Do we understand who we're doing business with? Not just from a customer supplier perspective, but also from a third parties who are doing business on behalf of the company or with the company. And then that takes us into the fourth piece, which is really the threat environment. Do we understand, based on the industries we're in and based on threat intelligence provided by not only the United States government, but governments around the globe where we may operate, do we understand who the threat actors are that are really interested in the company's assets? And here we're talking about specifically their digital assets. And have we built controls in place to understand how to both prevent those actors from getting in and how to detect them should they get in? And then finally, is this topic even resonating in the crisis response side? So there's this whole incident response. It's almost been treated like cyber was this separate thing. The reality is that cyber risk, like other risks to the company, should be part of the broader crisis response plan of the enterprise, and the company should be practicing its response mechanisms around that, including how management engages with the board on those topics, when the board should be informed on those topics, the responsibilities of the board, specifically which committee of the board is going to be involved, when does the full board get involved, what about the communications agenda associated with that. So there's certainly a line that the board understands that's management's responsibility, but there's also a responsibility that the board has. And so part of the reason that we put together the framework is so that both parties could understand their respective roles on this topic.
And this isn't something that is just nice to do. We had Bill Chandler on several months ago, talking about the liability of this. If a company hasn't made the effort to upgrade its controls, or if the board in their minutes has no reference to discussions about cyber risk, this puts them clearly in the sights of a plaintiff suit of some kind, or some kind of, if they have any kind of hiccup in their operation. So this is pretty important.
It is, and I would tell you the thinking on this topic has changed over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, this particular topic was largely not documented, was largely not shared, I think, with a lot of board members. At least that was our experience. And so what we began to understand is that boards needed to have documentary evidence that they exercised that business judgment, that oversight, and that management exercised that business judgment when they took on those risks. Because that transparency or lack of transparency between management and the board becomes problematic when something goes wrong and it's sort of being reviewed by third parties that may not have had that understanding. And so when you think about those 5 or 6 elements that I just walked through, let's walk through them again in the context of how it sort of lays out with the board's responsibilities. That first one around people is really about who's the responsible corporate officer on this particular topic, and what's the tone at the top. And when I say responsible corporate officer for the attorneys that are listening, I'm not talking about the application of the RCO doctrine. I'm really talking about, do we really have a single point of responsibility for this particular risk on a day-to-day basis? And are those risks documented? Are they in the artifacts of management? So are they properly registered in the enterprise risk management agenda? And what kind of tone have we set? So for example, if we have folks who are properly trained on cyber risks, and yet they violate company policy as it relates to mitigating that risk, are there artifacts to suggest the company's taken even any action on it? Or have we simply ignored it? And those facts are not good facts in the light of a third-party review.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Because I want to make sure we cover this in the time that we have. So we have a structure. We have these 6 points that we got to make sure. Take a moment and share with our audience, if there were the 5 critical questions that you as a director need to ask your management or your IT group, go over those 5 with me just so that we can share at least the entry-level questions that a board should be asking about their cyber oversight responsibilities.
So the first would be, what's the governance around this topic in the context of management? How does management sort of adjudicating this particular operational risk? The second would be, what are our duties and obligations from a data protection perspective? And again, do we understand what the regulatory and statutory obligations are, and what are the voluntary obligations? And the third is, what are the preventive and detective controls associated with those obligations? So that should then be tied off. That's essential to be able to demonstrate later that we really were a responsible operator of the infrastructure, and that, that the management and the board, management certainly considered those risks and that the board exercised appropriate oversight. The third is, do we really understand the threat environment? I will tell you, in the conduct of an investigation, there is the opportunity for certain artifacts to be presented that will either hold the company in good light, that it was a responsible corporate citizen, and that bad things happen to good companies, and therefore let's go focus on the adversary that did this to us. But there also is the opportunity that the artifacts do not hold the company in a good light, in which case now we're in a very different sort of tone with regulators and third parties who may be seeking to have some form of redress with the company. And then finally, the crisis response agenda. The board should certainly ask, is there a crisis response? Is this part of the crisis response plan? And when was the last time it was actually practiced? And did the executive team who's responsible for this actually show up for that? And are there good artifacts? And what kinds of lessons that were learned? And do those lessons flow back into the response plan that we have today? So if the board members think about this like they would other compliance programs, foreign corrupt practices, among others, if you think of it in that context, the topic becomes less daunting, the framework becomes self-evident, and we have a structure that then allows us to have a conversation that is much more about compliance and process and much less about technology and malware and APT and scary words that most board members are not familiar.
Well, and we know the crisis management is important because it's not if you are going to have a cyber event, it's more likely when you have a cyber event.
Right, and whether or not that cyber event, gives rise to some kind of, global notification that plays out in the press, or whether or not that event is much more quietly handled with the inside of the company or between the company and select third parties, law enforcement, both in the United States and abroad. That's the way you would prefer to have that handled, as opposed to having it play out in the press and it become almost evident that we're making up the plan as we go. We just don't want to be in that position.
Yeah, and we've seen it.
We may have seen that in the past.
Yes. So we want to make sure that people know we had to cover this very quickly, but this resource is available to everyone.
It is.
And where's the most logical place from your perspective?
The most logical place will be go to the PwC Center for Board Governance on our website, and that's where you'll find this as well as other articles that are uniquely designed for directors.
I know there's something else coming down the pike as part of your Audit Excellence series called Cybermetrics. It's going to be out soon as well, which is another good piece for any individuals that want to cover this. And we'll make sure that we get this on our site too, on Boardroom Resources. So Charles, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. Very important topic. Thanks for all the tools that directors can use. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week where we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.